接下来进行第3场特邀演讲。The next session will be the third inviting speech by our honorable speaker. 我们邀请静宜大学林思玲校长为我们主持。本场次演讲人为 Professor Kerry John Kennedy。Professor Kennedy 来自 The Education University of Hong Kong。演讲的题目为 Developing Civic Competence for a Precarious Future。Professor Kennedy 由于班机延误无法亲临现场，将改由预录影片进行演讲。接下来我们将时间交给主持人。
好，谢谢美丽的司仪，在座的黄董事长，还有基金会所有的伙伴，这一场工作非常辛苦的工作伙伴，还有我们在座的教育界的先进前辈，各位老师、各位学生，大家早安，大家好。好。好，因为一早来我接到了一个通知，就像刚刚司仪所说的。我们的 Professor Kerry Kennedy 现在可能准备要从香港搭飞机过来，所以等他到的时候，这个场次可能已经结束了。所以接下来的演讲，他会透过线上预录的影带来跟我们分享他今天的专题。但是是一个国际研讨会，所以他们希望我还是用一段英文为他致上一个欢迎词。所以后来我想在后来的整个语音的收录会比较方便，所以容我还是短短的用英文说一下我们对于Professor John Kennedy 的一些欢迎。Organizers, speakers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you. It has been a great honor for me to be the host of this session. My name is Lucia Ling, President of Providence University in Taichung, Taiwan. In this session, we have specially invited Professor Kerry John Kennedy from the Education University of Hong Kong to give a presentation. Professor Kerry Kennedy originally came from Australia. He is an emeritus professor, advisor member of the Department of Curriculum and Instruction. Civic and citizenship education and curriculum policy and theory are his research areas. Today, Professor Kennedy is going to share with us the topic on developing civic competence for a precarious future. Although the speaker is not here, dear friends, let's still give Professor Kennedy a big round of applause. And let's start the video. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kerry Kennedy. I'm really happy to be able to talk with you this afternoon. Of course, I prefer to be there with you in Taipei. But for the time being, at least, I hope we can start a conversation that will be helpful when we think about civic education for the future. Let me share my screen. What I want to do today is to talk about civic competence and how we might develop civic competence for what I have called a precarious future. And I'm going to try and proceed in the following way. First, we'll identify some issues that are related to precarious social and political contexts. Secondly, to look at whether or not democracy is in trouble and what it means if democracy is in trouble. Then we'll ask the question, will social media and radical forms of civic engagement help in the future? And finally, I want to ask the question, what will be the role of democratic institutions in the future? And finally, what will civic education look like in the future? What I want to argue to start off with is that the contexts around our thinking about civic education might be described as precarious. And I'll talk a little bit about that idea of precariousness a little bit later. But if we just reflect on the century that's progressing quickly, we notice that there are things like democratic backsliding, a really popular term in the current narrative around democracies and the problems that they face. There's then the term illiberal democracy, which when we first see it seems like a contradiction in terms. But in fact, we have one government in Europe, the government of Hungary, where Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister, makes it very clear that that's his purpose, is to deliver an illiberal democracy. And then what is the promise of social media? Much is written about the ways in which social media might be the way to bring particularly young people back into the political sphere. More radical forms of civic engagement, is that what we're really looking at? And how should civic education be developed to meet these specific challenges? And what form should it take? I think when we look at these questions, we need to understand that the contexts are indeed precarious contexts. Whether they're the context as seen here, which is the destruction of the Twin Towers in New York in 2001, whether what seems to be the growth of authoritarianism across the world, whether that's the context we need to take into consideration. And of course, we have witnessed in this century a financial crisis, very severe in many cases. The mobility issues around refugees also seek to define us, I think. And naturally the pandemic, which is the very reason that I'm not in Taiwan right now. So the 21st century, which perhaps started off with great promise, has ended up being one in which the contexts in which we think about civic education make us think very, very carefully. And in a very important sense, these contexts have stretched the limits of democratic institutions, witnessed the emergence of new political forces, and threatened the liberal international order and created momentous geopolitical disruptions. But why precarious? This is perhaps seems like an unusual word to use in this context. Originally, precariousness, or sometimes precarity, was a term used by sociologists to signal the precariousness of workers' conditions in the neoliberal state. In this presentation, however, and in line with Biglia and Marley's view, I want to use precarious because it implies a lack of life security and a feeling of permanently living in a state of flux, an unstable environment with no options for making plans for the future, even the very near one. Other writers, such as Butler, use the term vulnerabilities to suggest the uncertainty that's been created for all citizens, and both refer to the fragility that characterises a contingent world. So precariousness, vulnerability and fragility, if these are the drivers of the 21st century, creating a future of uncertainty, what are the implications for developing civic competence? Let me first look at the idea that democracy is in trouble. Because if democracy is in trouble, then civic competence and civic competency certainly is problematic. Yes, democratic backsliding, a popular term in the current narrative around democracy, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. That is, in that part of the world where after 1989 it was thought democracy would flourish. In many countries it hasn't flourished, and those countries that were thought to be democratic are becoming less so. And of course, the illiberal democracies, The democracies that use, for example, electoral democracy, win the support of people and then start to change the very democratic structures of their societies. And then there are the authoritarians. We notice these two here, one from Russia, one from Belarus. We notice them in Turkey, we notice them in Hungary. And so democracy, as Benedict exclaimed, is not a sure thing. We cannot depend that democracy is so appealing that it will appeal to everyone. So overall, it's clear that democracy is under pressure. But I would argue it's certainly not vanquished, and it's certainly not dead. We have reports such as the B2 Institute report on autocratizing changing nature. We have the results from the Economist's Global Democracy Index, all of which point to the pressures which democracy is under. But I would suggest to you, when you read these reports, to read them carefully, because while they often paint a very dim picture, I suspect it's not as dim as they would like us to believe. But this is an important lesson for civic education, and it demands a response, because the main lesson is you can't rely on democracy's appeal to ensure that democracy will spread. So, what else can we rely on? How can we try to support democracy and its development? And a lot of space in terms of the literature has been devoted to social media, and other space has been devoted to radical forms of civic engagement. So let's take a look at these for the next few minutes and try and make an assessment of what their contribution might be in the years ahead. Let's take social media first. Of course, social media is so extraordinarily popular, so extraordinarily widespread, with use rates that I think are just beyond the imagination that would have been around at the beginning of the century. And whether it's Facebook or Twitter or Snapchat or whatever it is, we do know that young people in particular, but not only young people, are so attracted to social media. Many have argued, particularly in the United States, that this is a new way to engage young people in democracies. But I want to issue a caution here, because I think a closer look at that argument makes it not as significant as it might seem. As you can see here, the big issue is that social media facilitates information sharing. And I think this was found to be true in the Arab Spring. It was certainly found to be true in the recent protests in Thailand. It was found to be true in the protests in Hong Kong. That social media brings information to people. It's an organizational device, rather than a device which directly engages people. And so you get terms like slacktivism and clicktivism to try and downgrade the importance of social engagement. Clicktivism being the ism that says, yeah, it's really easy to sit in front of the computer and click away because you're not really engaged. And slacktivism is much the same. Although with slacktivism you may well be engaged with an issue, but still the way you pursue that is on your computer. And the literature, particularly the social movement literature, argues that that is not engagement. It is not activism to sit in front of your computer. And so the argument is that social media engagement is too passive. It falls short both as a process and in its outcomes. So if you rely on social media in the future, it may be problematic. I think I agree with that argument, although I know that many will want to pursue the argument but nevertheless, I think it's important to understand that there are limitations around social media. What about civic engagement in its different forms? Conventional and unconventional. I think earlier on I referred to it as radical. Well, we know that conventional engagement is reflected pretty much there, but we should note that there's been an upturn in unconventional civic engagement. 96 countries experienced at least one violent demonstration in 2011. A 244% increase in the number of riots and general strikes. Europe had the largest number of protests, riots and strikes over the period, totaling 1,600 events from 2011 to 2018. So unconventional participation is on the rise and has been on the rise now for some time. But we need to look at it carefully. Lapriano argued that illegality is clearly beyond the acceptable boundaries of the political establishment and its institutional norms. And that's not an unrealistic view about unconventional forms of civic engagement. In some research, some colleagues and I have recently completed here in Hong Kong, where we sought the views of ethnic minority groups on the recent 2019 protests, we found something quite similar to this view that at the beginning of the protest, ethnic minority groups were very supportive, or at least younger people within those groups were supportive. But violence turned almost the whole of the ethnic minority community around. And by the end of the protest, there was very little support from that part of the city. So there are some important issues there. On the other hand, Pasternak argued that recent violent protests in Hong Kong were morally defensible. And so you have these two views of unconventional civic engagement, what it does in terms of legal structures, but what it stands for in terms of morality. So what's the issue for civic education? Young people, in my view, need to be in a position to make an informed decision about how they will engage civically. They need to be able to identify fake news, resist peer pressure, understand the issues, and be aware of the implications of such involvement. This is not a call to make civic education the platform for preparing young people to adopt unconventional forms of civic engagement. It is a call to help young people become aware of what they need to do when they make decisions about different forms of civic engagement. And the issue around fake news and peer pressure are very significant issues for young people, and they deserve to have our help as civic educators. What about democratic institutions? I want to make the argument now quite strongly that civic engagement depends on democratic institutions. These institutions define it, sanction it, and regulate it. Whether it's the legislature, the courts, or the departments of state within a democracy, it is the institutions of democracy that allow it to happen, or not. Because in liberal democracies, where democratic institutions are disappearing, so too are multiple forms of civic engagement. So let me try and pursue this argument. O'Donnell argued that the idea of institutional democracy had important implications for schools. He went on to argue that civic competence requires an understanding of the grammar of the relevant institutions. That grammar has to be explained and learnt. The necessary training to participate in any institutional context might best take place within the given setting, but education about the functioning and distribution of power and rewards in organisations should begin at school along with political education. That is to say, schools are places where young people ought to learn about democratic institutions. Simple argument, maybe contested argument in some cases, but it's the argument that I'm making here this afternoon. This leads us to then the future of civic education and how we might be able to construct it. The formal curriculum of whatever type, whether it's a subject-based curriculum, whether it's an integrated curriculum, whether it's an extracurricular function. There are multiple ways in which civic education could be developed. But whichever way it's developed, it needs to introduce students to the institutions of democracy that characterise their society. Students can read about these institutions, plenty of textbooks. They can visit them, that is, experience them. They can listen to talks from people who work in them and take part in debates and discussions about community issues. And they can role play the way parliaments and political leaders work. Students can study the history of these institutions. They can learn about the controversial issues that may have been associated with them. They can identify the leaders who have influenced them, their strengths and weaknesses. They can understand the roles these institutions have played in creating a democratic society. There's a lot that the curriculum should contain that would support the preparation of future citizens. But most importantly, students need to learn how to participate in these institutions. You know, when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, around about 50% of people voted in the United States. 50%. If people knew the importance of voting, maybe that would not have happened. And it's the same with Brexit. 30% of people in Great Britain didn't vote for Brexit. They didn't vote. 70% did, which was a very high turnout rate. But the turnout rate in that case was not so important. 30% of people did not vote. If people do not vote, the things that happen may not be the things that are in the best interests of democracy. Students also need to learn how to influence these institutions and how to use them to bring about changes that will benefit society. We sometimes think that democratic institutions belong to the people who are part of them. For example, that the legislatures do belong to the politicians. That's not correct. Politicians are there, in democratic societies at least, because people elect them. Citizens elect them. You can't elect them and then leave them unsupervised. Politicians, bureaucrats, people who seek to influence governments to do things in certain ways need to be supervised. And this is the classic task of citizens in a democracy. If they don't do this, then democracy comes under threat, as we've seen recently in different parts of the world. Now, institutions may not be the only thing about which students learn as part of civic education. But at the very least, they need to learn that without these institutions, there is no democracy. That's my main point. Democratic institutions preserve democracy. In the United States, for example, it's generally claimed now that it was democratic institutions that saved the United States from faltering into authoritarianism. It was only those institutions that saved it. And we can see in that context in particular just how much pressure those institutions were subject to. And that can be seen in many other parts of the world. And so the lesson is, I think, for civic education, that those institutions need to be preserved, irrespective of political party, irrespective of whether you vote on the left or the right. It is the institutions that create democracy. And that's what young people need to both understand and become part of. Now, this may sound like a very conservative agenda for the future, but I would argue that it's a radical agenda. It's radical because we want young people in the future to participate in the institutions that very much control their societies. And if they don't participate, it is very clear that these institutions can disappear. Of course, there is also a problem. And the problem is, and this is where I'm going to end my presentation, the problem is how to do it. And so I want to present to you this model which I developed with some colleagues when we were talking about open classroom climate. Often we talk about the democratic classroom, particularly in Western contexts. We talk about classrooms that follow the principles of democracy. Now, of course, democratic classrooms are important, but research has started to tell us some new things and some not so new things about what might be called an open classroom climate. An open classroom climate is one where students are encouraged to ask questions, to debate and discuss with one another and with their teachers and with their parents, to listen respectfully, to respond according to their own views and understandings, and to be open themselves about what they hear and what they are learning. Teachers, of course, are fundamental in this process, but so too are students, because listening to others is not always what our students do. Just as in our society, listening is not the skill that's most practiced. But research tells us a few things about how to develop open classroom climates. For example, research tells us that boys are probably less engaged in civic education classrooms than girls. So for teachers, the challenge is to make sure that boys are not left to sit idle, are not left to cause problems, but are engaged in what is going on in the classroom. Sometimes for teachers it's easier to deal with those who are engaged. The big challenge for teachers is to create engagement for those who do not feel they want to be engaged. So yes, democratic classrooms are a good way to go, but not every student in that classroom is the same. And there may have to be different ways of dealing with different students. The other thing that research tells us, that open classroom climate helps to build citizenship efficacy. That is, to build a kind of efficacy where what citizens do actually counts. You hear so many people say, well, I'm just one voice in a democracy. What can I do? What can I say? If students have experience of an open classroom climate, it helps to develop the efficacy in which they do say, well, yes, I will write a letter to the person who represents me in Parliament. Yes, I will write a letter to the person next door. I will do something because I know that it will work in the end. Citizenship efficacy is a significant social outcome of schooling, and it's facilitated by open classroom climate. Open classroom climate, the most significant variable that correlates with open classroom climate is
a knowledge-rich environment. We find that students in the large international studies of civic education, those conducted by the IEA, are the ones who most notice the importance of classroom climate and report that they have experienced open classroom climate. That is true here in Taiwan, it is true in Hong Kong, that students who report having experienced open classroom climate are likely to be those students who do better, that is, have more knowledge and more understanding of civic education. Beyond the classroom, the involvement of parents is important, and we know that an open classroom climate is able to involve parents because assignments, homework, projects lead students to talk with their parents about these issues. And in fact, that kind of assignment that involves parents ought to be on every city classroom list, because apart from listening and engaging what's happening in the classroom, students are engaged anyway in their home. Even if they're not actively involved with what their parents do politically, they listen to them, they know what their parents' views are, and they can engage with them, they can discuss with them, they can debate with them. So it's beyond the classroom, and it's very important, and it's facilitated by open classroom climate. And finally, and most importantly, research shows that open classroom climate develops positive student-teacher relationships. We know that positive student-teacher relationships are then closely related to students' sense of belonging in the school. So many students, you know, who are engaged in our research activities, when you ask them, do you feel that you belong in your school? They say no. And then when we look at their scores on civic knowledge, we find they have lower scores on civic knowledge. They have lower self-efficacy scores. We find that the majority of these students are boys rather than girls, and so you can start to see how this circle works. Open classroom climate can help to develop a sense of belonging by developing positive student-teacher relationships. Is this too much to claim for one single instructional variable? Well, the research is pretty clear that it's not. Of course, every classroom is a little different. Every classroom will do things in a slightly different way, but the openness of the classroom, even to the point of the student feeling that they can disagree with their teacher, is a variable that research endorses as one which is influential in the way students' civic knowledge and civic engagement develops. So on the one hand, what I've argued in this presentation is that I think for the future, support for democratic institutions as part of the school curriculum is absolutely essential. And on the other hand, to make that work properly needs a pedagogy, which here I call open classroom climate. You can't have one without the other. You can't have a didactic classroom and at the same time civic learning that will be useful and productive. There are many ways as we move forward into the future, and we've heard many of them at the conference this weekend. And I hope that this is just one contribution that can be made, that people may discuss it and debate it and work out how it might fit into a broader overview and plan for civic education for the future. I hope it is a useful way to think about it, and I look forward to discussions, perhaps not this weekend, but at another time, when we might be able to meet together and talk again about what is happening. How is civic education changing? How is it preparing young people for a future that's precarious, and uncertain. Thanks very much for listening, and I hope to meet you in the future soon. Thank you.
We thank you, Professor Kerry Kennedy's speech. As a summary, in the time of the precariousness, vulnerability, fragility in our society, according to Professor Kennedy, he emphasized future citizens will need a strong foundation of knowledge, skills, and values to support them for their civic lives. He also emphasized that our young people need to understand the importance of democratic institutions, how to contribute to them, and how to value them. He also mentioned it is not optional for us, it is essential for this. He said that it is not either institutional democracy or participatory democracy. It is both, that civic education needs to recognize this relationship and prepare our young people to be both knowledgeable about this institution and also willing to participate in them. And this requires innovative pedagogy and the development of democratic school community. In Chinese, 在刚刚的演讲里面 ，Professor Kennedy 说，在这个不稳定、脆弱以及易碎性的社会时代，制度的民主跟参与的民主，对于年轻人的培育是同样的重要。所以他后来特别提出来，为了要确保我们在未来的公民教育有一个比较好跟丰富性的课程，应该要确保在开放性课程跟课堂的气候里，确保每位参与、每位学生都摄入了学习的过程，而且能够逐步建立他们的公民效能。丰富性课堂的内容，在作业或者回家的学习活动上，能够促进家长跟学生彼此的对话，跟讨论当代社会的议题。更重要的是正向的师生关系。各位听众，谢谢大家今天的参与。那 Professor 特别提出来，如果对这个议题你有任何的问题，欢迎你写下来。然后今天下午他到的时候，应该可以找到机会，可以对他提问，或者对于这个议题有更充分的讨论。这个场次，我们在这个丰富性而且非常资讯性的学习跟彼此分享之后，作为一个结束，然后我们在休息之后再回来。谢谢大家 ，Thank you very much。
谢谢林校长的主持和 Professor Kennedy 的演讲。我们请林校长在台前与我们的黄董事长合影。
好，来看这边来，校长1、2、3。好，来，好 ，OK。
谢谢大家。